Today, I want to begin with what I believe is the most dangerous sentence in the world. And no, it's not hateful, it's not angry, and it's not offensive. In fact, you've probably heard it 1,000 times, and you may have even said it yourself. Here it is. That's just the way I am. 4 simple words. 4 words that sound harmless, but hidden inside of them is something incredibly dangerous. Because every time we say that sentence, we quietly convince ourselves that change is no longer possible. I'm just impatient. I'm terrible with money. I've always been this way. Nah, I'm not a leader. Or I'm just shy. And without realizing it, we stop describing ourselves and start sentencing ourselves. The truth is, there's a huge difference between recognizing a current reality and declaring a permanent identity. One invites growth, the other quietly locks the door. And over the past several episodes, we've talked about perspective and truth and kindness. Today, we're talking about another step in that journey by exploring something even deeper: identity. Who are you? Who told you that's who you are? And perhaps the most important question of all, who could you become if you stop believing the story that you've always told yourself? I believe one of the greatest freedoms in life has nothing to do with where you live, how much money you have, or what title you hold. It begins the moment you realize you are allowed to change. In fact, I want to introduce you to a thought that we'll come back to throughout today's conversation. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. If that sentence is true, and I believe it is, then today's episode isn't about just identity. It's about freedom. Are you ready? I am. I'm Jonah. I'm your person. Let's get to it. Welcome back to the show. Before we go any further, I'd like to welcome everyone joining us from around the world. Whether you're listening from Portugal, Japan, Israel, Kuwait, Mexico, Bulgaria, Sweden, Senegal, or somewhere across the 78 countries that now make up this incredible community. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. I really appreciate it. Every week, we're proving something together, that no matter where you live or what language you speak, we're all trying to answer many of the same questions about life, growth, purpose, and becoming better than we were yesterday. Now, let's talk about identity. One of the most interesting things about human beings is that we all have a story we tell ourselves about who we are. Sometimes that story helps us, but sometimes it holds us back. The problem begins when we stop saying, "This is something I do," and start saying, "This is who I am." Think about how often we hear statements like these. "I'm just bad with money. I've never been disciplined. I'm not creative. I'm terrible at relationships. I'm just an anxious person. I'm not leadership material." Those don't sound like temporary struggles. They sound permanent. And when someone feels permanent, our brain quietly stops looking for another possibility. That's why I believe one of the most dangerous things we can do is confuse our current condition with our permanent identity. Being impatient doesn't mean you are an impatient person. Struggling with confidence doesn't mean confidence is forever out of your reach. Or making poor decisions in the past doesn't mean poor decisions have to define your future. Those are experiences, not life sentences. Every one of us has habits we'd like to improve, or weaknesses we'd like to overcome, or skills we'd like to develop. But growth becomes almost impossible when we convince ourselves that our limitations are simply who we are. Because if that's who I am, why would I even change? Why would I try to change? That's how invisible cages are built. Not with steel bars, but with sentences repeat until they sound like truth. And here's something I hope you'll carry with you throughout this episode. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. Because maybe, just maybe, the person you become next begins with refusing to let yesterday introduce you to tomorrow. Let's find out where these stories come from. Here's something I don't think we ask ourselves often enough. Who told you that's who you are? Seriously, take a moment and think about it. When did you first decide you weren't good enough? Who convinced you that you weren't a good leader? Who taught you that you weren't creative? Or who made you believe you weren't intelligent or confident, disciplined, or even worthy? Because I have a suspicion. Many of the labels we've carried for years didn't begin with us. Here's going to be a whole handful of possibilities. Maybe they started with a careless comment from a parent, or a teacher who underestimated you, or a coach who didn't see your potential, or a bully who repeated something until you believed it. I don't know, maybe a failed relationship, or a mistake you made years ago. Or maybe it wasn't another person at all. Maybe it was one bad experience that quietly became your identity. You failed once, so you decided you were a failure. You were rejected once, so you decided you weren't lovable. Or you struggled speaking in front of people, so you concluded you weren't a public speaker. It's amazing how quickly our minds can take a single moment and turn it into a lifelong story. But here's the problem. Stories are powerful. They shape the way we see ourselves. They influence the risks we're willing to take, or the opportunities we pursue, or even the conversations we avoid. Or worse yet, the dreams we quietly abandon. And after enough time, we stop questioning the story altogether. We simply accept it as truth. But what if it isn't? What if you've spent years living inside a story that was written by someone else, or worse, written by the worst day of your life? I want to remind you of something. Just because a chapter happened doesn't mean it gets to become the title of your book. You have the ability to write new chapters, to develop new habits, to create and build new confidence, or to become someone your younger self never imagined. That's why I believe freedom doesn't begin when our circumstances change. It begins when we challenge the stories we've mistaken for identity. Because every story can be edited, every belief can be examined, and every label deserves one simple question. Is this really who I am? Or is this simply the story I've been telling myself? Remember this. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. And once we begin asking that question, everything starts to change. Let's talk about why your brain believes those stories in the first place. Have you ever noticed that the more you say something about yourself, the more it starts to feel true? That's because your brain is always listening. Whether what you're saying is helpful or harmful, it pays attention. Think about someone who repeatedly says this, "I'm terrible with names." What happens the next time they're introduced to someone? Their brain almost expects to forget. Or someone who says, "I'm just not disciplined. I always quit." Or "I'm terrible under pressure." Every time those sentences are repeated, they become more than words. They become instructions. And eventually, our behaviors begin aligning with the identity we've created. Not because we're destined to become that person, but because our mind naturally looks for evidence that confirms what we already believe. If I believe I'm impatient, I'll notice every impatient moment and ignore the patient ones. If I believe I'm not a good leader, I'll remember every mistake I make and overlook every time I influence someone positively. It's almost as if our mind becomes an attorney, gathering evidence to prove that our identity is correct. The problem is, the attorney only argues the case we've handed it. So maybe the better question isn't, what evidence do I have? Maybe it's, what case have I been asking my mind to prove? That question changed the way I look at personal growth. Because if I've spent years rehearsing an identity that limits me, maybe I can begin rehearsing one that frees me. Not pretending, not by lying to myself, but by recognizing that growth is possible, that I'm capable of learning, capable of improving, and capable of becoming. Remember what we said throughout this episode. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. The stories we repeat become the identities we protect. But the moment we choose a better story, our future begins listening as well. And that might be the real reason why transformation begins. Now, let's talk about the moment we can finally change the story. Every meaningful change in your life begins with a single moment. Not the moment you become perfect, and not the moment everything finally clicks. The moment you give yourself permission to believe that change is possible. Because as long as we keep saying, "That's just the way I am," nothing has to change. It's a comfortable sentence. It removes responsibility, and it lowers expectations. It even gives you permission to stay exactly where you are. But the instant we replace that sentence with another, everything begins to shift. So instead of saying, "I'm just not confident," what if you said, "I'm learning to become more confident"? Instead of saying, "I've always had a bad temper," what if you said, "I'm learning how to respond differently"? Instead of saying, "I'm not a leader," what if you said, "I'm developing into somebody others can trust"? Do you hear the difference? The first sentence closes the door. The second one opens a window. Neither of them ignore reality. One simply leaves room for growth. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves: permission to become. Not because we've arrived, but because we're still under construction. And some people believe that changing their mind or changing their habits or even changing who they are somehow means they're fake or they were fake before. I don't see it that way. I think growth is one of the most authentic things that human beings can do. Hell, trees grow, muscles grow, and knowledge grows. Why should our character be any different? The tragedy isn't that people change. The tragedy is when people convince themselves they cannot change. Remember, freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. That freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives one decision at a time, one habit at a time, one courageous sentence at a time. And because the moment you stop introducing yourself with your limitations, you finally give your future permission to introduce itself to you. And that may be the most life-changing conversation you'll ever have. So here's your challenge for the week. Pay attention to the way you talk about yourself. Every time you catch yourself saying, "That's just the way I am," pause. Replace it with, "I'm becoming someone who," and then finish the sentence. Then ask yourself one question. What would that person do today? Do that one thing, because your future is built on one sentence at a time. Before we jump back into the show, if you're enjoying these conversations, I'd really appreciate it if you take a second to follow the show, subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone you care about. Even a like, a comment, or a follow and a share helps these conversations reach people who might not otherwise hear them. And that's how this community continues to grow. All right, let's get back into it. I want to share something that has become one of my favorite reminders. You are not finished. I don't care if you're 18, 38, or 88. If you're still breathing, you're still becoming. Somewhere along the way, many of us started treating life like it's a finished sculpture. This is who I am. This is what I'm good at. This is all I'll ever be. But I don't think life works that way. I think life is more like writing a book. Every day, you wake up with a blank page. You don't get to rewrite yesterday's chapter, but you absolutely get to decide what today's chapter says. And that's powerful. Because one decision today can begin changing a story that's been heading in the wrong direction for years. Think about the strongest people you know. I doubt that they were born that way. Someone who is patient probably had to learn patience. Someone who communicates well probably wasn't always a good communicator. Someone who leads with confidence probably spent years doubting themselves before they were even inspired by another person. Growth is almost always invisible whilst it's happening. You don't notice it from day to day or one day to the next, but 1 year later, 5 years later, you realize you're responding differently, or thinking differently, or living differently. That's because identity isn't something you find once. It's something you build every single day, brick by brick, choice by choice, habit by habit. And every one of those choices casts a vote for the person you're becoming. And that's why I hope you never introduce yourself with your limitations, that you introduce yourself with your potential, not because you're pretending to be someone you're not, but because you're refusing to forget who you're capable of becoming. Remember, freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. I don't know where you are in your journey today. Maybe you're starting over. Maybe you're rebuilding. Or maybe you're rediscovering a version of yourself you've never met before. Wherever you are, don't stop, because you're not finished. Heck, you're not even close. Let's close this conversation by talking about the courage it takes to keep becoming. As we bring this conversation to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought. I don't believe the greatest freedom in life is financial freedom, or freedom from responsibility, or even freedom from adversity. I think the greatest freedom you'll ever experience is realizing that your past doesn't get the final vote on your future. Read that again in your mind. Your past doesn't get the final vote. Yes, your past has shaped you, it has taught you, and it has challenged you, and it actually may have wounded you, but it does not own you. That's an important difference between being influenced by your past and being imprisoned by it. One teaches you, the other defines you. And the sentence, "That's just the way I am," quietly hands the keys of your future to your past. I don't want that for you. I want you to understand that every day you wake up with one extraordinary opportunity, the opportunity to become, not overnight and not all at once, but little by little, choice by choice, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. Because that's how remarkable lives are built. Not through one dramatic transformation, but through thousands of small decisions that all point in the same direction. I hope that the next time you're tempted to say, "That's who I am," you'll catch yourself. Instead, ask, what kind of person am I becoming? Because that question creates movement. It creates hope. It creates possibility. And ultimately, it creates freedom. Remember this sentence, because I hope it stays with you long after this episode ends today. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. Maybe that's the real danger of the world's most dangerous sentence. Not that it describes who you are today, but it quietly convinces us we can never become anyone else. I don't believe that, not for 1 minute. And I hope, after today, you won't either. So today, remove one sentence from your vocabulary. "That's just the way I am." And replace it with, "I'm becoming someone who," then finish the sentence, write it down, read it tomorrow, and start living like it's already becoming true. Your future is listening. You know, I think one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves is permission to change. Not because we're ashamed of who we've been, and not because our past has no value, but because we recognize that growth is one of the greatest privileges of being human. Imagine if a tree decided it had grown enough. Imagine if an artist decided there was nothing left to learn. Or imagine if a leader believed there was no more room to grow or improve. We'd all agree that that would be a tragedy. So why do we sometimes say those same things about ourselves? The sentence, "That's just who I am," doesn't simply describe who we are today. It quietly suggests that tomorrow has already been decided. I don't believe that. I believe tomorrow is still being written. I believe that your next decision matters. I believe your next conversation matters. I also believe your next act of courage matters. Most of all, I believe that the person you're becoming is far more important than the person you've been. So don't let yesterday become your identity. Let it become your education. Carry the lessons, leave the limitations, and keep moving forward. Before we go, I want you to remember one sentence. Not the most dangerous sentence in the world, the one that sets us free. Freedom begins the moment we stop confusing who we've been with who we're capable of becoming. If that idea stays with you, then this episode accomplished exactly what I hoped it would. And in the next few hours, we're going to build on this conversation with what I believe may be the most powerful question in the world. What if I'm wrong? In episode 86. Until then, thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for believing that growth is possible. And thank you for continuing to challenge yourself to think a little differently than you did yesterday. For now, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for coming back. See you in a few hours.